And welcome again to Turtletalks.net. We're here broadcasting from Truth or Consequences, New Mexico, who has hot springs as well as truth and consequences. I'm here with Bob Jackson. We were talking last time about climate, and its effects possibly on all kinds of things, including the economics and natural world. Bob, last time we closed with the notion of blueberries and how they need to be pollinated, and how unfortunately a third of the hives they brought on, the hives died, and it's becoming a real problem because we do need pollinators. So he said the Chinese are way ahead of us. He said they use a different species. He said they use Homo sapiens, and I said, wait a minute, that's us. He said, yeah, they can be trained to, we can be trained to pollinate. And anyway, so that's where we're going to launch into it now with that notion and see where it goes. Hope you enjoy it. And please remember to send us your questions, answers, comments, anything that will help us to shape this ongoing conversation about this, I guess we call it life, but particularly I would say peaked experience of life that we're going through now, because we're so interconnected as we are with through this podcast, for instance, to people all over the world. So, Bob, good afternoon.
Good afternoon. It's good to be back. One of the things that we did talk about, as Amin mentioned last time, was climate change, and specifically the issues that we faced in a group that I happen to be part of, where we own a blueberry farm, and we've had real challenges with the climate impact and pesticide impact on our pollinators, which we have to have every year, obviously, for a crop, and what that means to each and every one of us relative to our food supply and the threats to pollinators. As Amin mentioned, and we mentioned last time, we did lose about a third of all of our beehives last year, which is better than average in the current environment, but extraordinarily challenging and expensive. And it's interesting that people are saying, well, aren't there alternatives? And there definitely are alternatives. We talked a little bit last time about what you can do individually, just stimulating the environment and helping provide an environment that's healthy for bees and other pollinators. We don't only use honeybees on our farm, we also use bumblebees. And the one interesting thing about bumblebees is they tend to roam. And so you can spend a lot of money, which we have, bringing bumblebees in during the pollination season. And when you let them go, they are
They head to their condo in Las Vegas.
Yeah. After only about a week or two on the job, they just and so they're quite mobile. But the Chinese, in a couple of agricultural valleys in China, they're facing similar problems with pollinators, and what they've resorted to is actually training human beings, Homo sapiens, to handle the pollination of those crops. And it's not a job that many people have aspired to, but it's a job that many people in China have been placed into that role. And it is something that we can do. It's a digital process. You take these digits on your hand and you just transfer that pollen, from the stamen to the anther, and then you have a pollinated plant. I believe I got that right. If not, anyone listening that's more well versed on the anatomy of the flower can correct us, but it's merely just transferring that pollen and pollinating the plant. In fact, I recently happened to be on a large pecan plantation, 3,600 acres of pecan trees. Yeah, pecans, as they call them in the South. And it was fascinating, because I was just thinking how fortunate the owner of that farm is that they don't have to depend on pollinators. Pecan trees are wind
pollinated. Oh, down here in New Mexico, we have a lot of pecans, and we have a lot of wind.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Probably works.
So the wind is doing its job. It's just the difficulty the insects are having. And in the last week, since our previous discussion, there have been a few new articles come out about not only the insect population that we were talking about and the biomass decline in insects, which has been 75% over the last 2 decades, which is shocking. But now they're releasing the statistics in several science journals about the decline in the population of birds on the planet.
Well, don't they go together? I mean, don't birds feed
Of a
on
feather?
insects? Yeah, whichever feather they're part of. I mean, some
Yeah.
birds, others are carrion related. Some
Mm-hmm.
swoop and eat the other birds. But I always thought that the birds were living there in your backyard because they had something to eat, and the small worms and insects.
Mm-hmm.
It was their protein quotient.
Well, and it does go, I wouldn't say hand in hand, but
Maybe
Yeah.
beak and
wing
Claw.
or winging it. But while we're winging it with our conversation today, the interesting thing about the decline in the bird population is it does seem that it's directly related to the decline in the insect population, because birds obviously eat insects. And as you mentioned, many species of birds, they predominantly eat insects. So with the insect population declining, you'll see that have an impact on the population of birds. The Audubon Society's data that was released last week, they were indicating that they've seen a decline over a 50-year period, which is obviously a very long-term
back to the
study.
70s.
Here in Truth or Consequences, it's interesting that when we were discussing this a few days ago back and forth with the information that had been released, what we have noticed personally, and I mean literally in our own backyard, is a number of changes that are shocking just in the course of one season. Last year, we had a view across the valley of a parking lot in front of a clubhouse that had downward facing lights. So last summer, it was frenetic with activity of insects in those lights, bats swooping down into the lights, nighthawks swooping down into the lights to eat the insects, and occasionally great horned owls swooping down in to eat whatever happened to be in front of them, including the occasional bat we thought we saw. So it was really interesting, and my wife and I, we can see that from a couple of 100 yards away, but we actually would drive over there occasionally and just park and watch all this activity. This summer, one season later, we have not seen one bat or bird in those lights because of the decline in insects in 1 year. It's also interesting that unlike last year, we had just an absolute in the last several weeks of phenomenal outbreak of gnats.
Yes, tremendous.
And you'd say, well, wait a minute, I thought there was a decline in insects. And the point we brought up last week, which I believe is at the heart of understanding of this situation, is that balance is dynamic.
Yes.
And we've let things get so far out of balance in recent decades that we have to swing the scale too far to the other side to try to balance things out. And in the case of insects over the millennia have developed in the face of natural predators, which have also developed, and it would keep everything in balance.
Right.
Now, with the complete disappearance of certain species or the extinction of certain species, things are out of balance. And so when you have gnats now being born, if you have fewer birds to feed on the larvae, if you have fewer insects to feed on the gnats, if you have fewer dragonflies that tend to feed on those type insects, which we do have a lot fewer dragonflies this year than last year, then you're going to find that a lot of times it's deceptive. You have a lot of heat and someone says, what happened to global warming? It's climate change. It's not global warming. And so you have a lot of heat because the extremes are more severe. And this will probably be what we'll witness with insect populations as well.
Well, I know in upstate New York, the apple orchards, the problem is that it's really kind of interesting. Because of the seasonal shift of it getting warmer earlier, allowing for certain things to occur out of phase.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a timing thing where I don't know, they were having problems with pollinators as well in the apple orchards, and they were trying to understand it all, and it was an insect bird problem because the insects were coming earlier and then maturing quicker, and they were turning into different stages of their life, and therefore the birds into this, and it just, it's like mismatching what has been a balance, not in temperature exactly, but in the life cycle of several animals and insects that were out of phase.
Mm-hmm.
So this species starves because normally when the little chickies of the birds were ready to be fed, the worms weren't there anymore. They were underground already, or in other words, it's like showing up to the supermarket at 10 minutes after 11 and the place is closed. And you wait a minute, where I want my ice cream. Oh, well, I'm sorry, you're out of phase.
Mm-hmm.
It's closed. And that's a large scale. That's like vast numbers. So I heard that the Greeks loved the golden mean. The golden mean was that ideal ratio, and it took me a while to understand that. It turns out that they were very passionate people, and so their ideal was the golden mean, which they never achieved.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, we can look back on history and say, "Oh, they really had it together. They were, rational society. We got Socrates and Plato, all of that." Well, we like to remember that, but actually, they weren't white marbled columns. They were gaudy paintings of lewd scenes and life itself, and it was a vibrant society. And the philosophers came along and said, "Well, that's a little bit extreme that way or extreme this way. We really better head for that middle ground." The only way you get a middle ground is you go off on one way or the other, and that's where we're at now with the way the balance of nature is so far off. And I'm recalling now a story about cattle herds in Africa, where what happens is that if you don't manage the herds because they're domesticated, they add to desertification because they not only trample the soil, but they stick around and trample it more, and so consequently there's no topsoil left for the little grasses to grow. So in comes the MIT, Cambridge know-it-alls, and they go, well, the obvious thing is to get rid of the cattle. No more meat, forget the cattle. That didn't help. In fact, it made it worse. And the reason it made it worse was they need to come in just at the rainy season to puncture the earth and then be moved so that the grass seeds and so on from their own cycle of manure will be transported from what they ate and be deposited, and then you have the grasses growing again, and the desert is being held back. So it's not like we were lowest common denominator. Homo sapiens can be trained to pollinate. We can little mascara brushes or whatever we need to do, and we can do that. But we can also be trained by the environment, which I think is a harsh teacher. There's no habeas corpus. There's no mercy. You either go by nature's laws or you go, the highway is that way. And there doesn't go anywhere anymore. So I don't know what we're going to do at that point. But my point is, let's learn and aid and abet nature to bring back some of these cycles. And we have the wherewithal, we have the expertise, we certainly have the mechanical means and the electronic means to do all kinds of things. I mean, if you can put artificial fertilizer on fields with giant machines and do all this hybridization and cross-cultural GMO thing, then we can certainly help our natural friends that actually are part of our life cycle. It's an odd thing when you know, it's not even it's kind of simplistic. It is a little bit like sawing off the limb from the other side that you're sitting on. You know, we have this ability to somehow not understand our position. It's kind of odd, I think. I mean, it may be the fact that our eyes look out and we're not self-reflective. That could be it. We're kind of biased towards going forward. We don't have, some species have eyes that can see 360. If we had eyes that can see 360, maybe we would be in a better shape. But right now, we're just tunnel vision, and we're not seeing our effect.
Well, one of the things that I was glad that we covered the last time we had this discussion a week ago, where we were beginning the discussion on climate change, is we just quoted what was in a recent New Yorker magazine article about what we have to look forward to. And when you think about the Chinese and actually using human beings as pollinators, because they have such a significant and huge problem with pollinators in those areas, you say, wow, you know, that's a desperate measure. Well, desperate times call for desperate measures. And one of the things that we need to do, not looking out of the problem, but looking in, is realize we are in the midst of a desperate time. These issues with insects, these issues with pollinators are merely facets of the different elements of desperate times that we're in, and we are in them. We are not talking about something that's going to happen 20, 30, 40, 50 years from now. It is happening right now. And so the one thing that was really great about that article, it was saying, you know, you may feel, as I've wrestled with for quite a long time, you may feel powerless to do things on a global basis when it's a global problem. And this is, as we said, it's a humanity problem. It's a societal problem. It's an issue that hits at our core of things that we vitally have to have. We need food, for example. Our food supply is important to most everyone that listens to what we're talking about. And so that's what we're dealing with, extraordinary consequences to something that has been going on for a long time, that has been out of balance, and that we need to swing that balance overly to the other side to try to slow down the progress, if you want to call it that, of these issues.
Well, you know, I clumped onto one phrase that you said, which is it's a global issue. But, and however, and therefore, consequently, all politics is local. That's a maximum politics. It comes down to you as the voter. You know, well, all ecology is local. It's not some foreign alien that I know of putting their hand out the window and throwing out a plastic thing into the environment. It's not a global problem that you've allowed this plastics manufacturing plant to pollute your river while taking petroleum and turning it into something that won't ever, as far as I know, half-life of 30,000 years, dissolve. And when it does dissolve, then the rest of the ecosystem gets sick because now it's eating microplastics and so on. So yes, I agree. It is a global problem. We've allowed it to get to be a global problem because we have global economics. Mm-hmm. We have global companies. I liken our times to the Italian city-states. I don't know if anybody's a history buff, but there was a moment when the Medici banking family had its own private army, and it was more powerful than any municipality. Pisa, Venice. In other words, they were international bankers, and they had more power than the individual city-states, because Italy didn't become, I don't know my history all that much, but early 19th century actually became Italy. It was not a nation. It was a series of little fiefdoms and cities. Okay. So my point is that now we have multinational corporations whose gross product each year is bigger than 30 or 40 countries in the world. They, in fact, are above the law. In fact, they make the law in those countries by bribery or however they do it, because we have different lobbying, which is this very sophisticated bribery. How are they doing that? Well, they're doing that with local representatives who are responsible either in a democracy or in a pitchfork and torch system with a dictatorship in which the transitions of power are a little more violent. Still a local problem. And what does it come down to? A decision an individual makes, a family makes, a clan makes, a tribe makes. We're making decisions. That's what I feel, as individuals, as if the problem is too big. We can't do anything because, well, I mean, the forces involved. There's armies and borders and border guards, and people can't go freely anywhere in the world. While the transportation is up and everyone can, we're very, I don't know, 1 year's salary in some countries, get on a plane and go thousands of miles away to another country. So we have all kinds of issues. But consequently, we need to deal with our own sphere of influence, natural sphere. Bob, you know somebody. Well, I'll bet that you know somebody who knows the governor of New Mexico. You don't know the governor yourself, unless I'm wrong. But I'll bet that you know somebody who knows somebody who is on a speaking basis with the governor of New Mexico or our representative from in Las Cruces. That's your natural sphere of influence. You don't know that, but you can say to your friend, I think we need to do something locally in action, not just in words, but in action. How we live our lives makes a difference. Because I'll live this way, and then you convince your buddy to say, well, why don't you plant some pollinating native flowers so that the pollinators have something to eat, butterflies have somewhere to go, because that's what I'm doing. And then they do it, and then their friend who knows the governor says, that's what I'm doing, and they go, oh, well, maybe we should make this an initiative. Maybe we can support this effort with bringing in seeds of these plants that are, that thrive here and are indigenous. And but let's do it on a massive scale. Let's see what that means. So anyway, I feel like when we make it a massive global problem, we call in the Marines. Space, our new Space Force. Space Force.
Yes.
Let's deal with it, right?
Yeah. Well, and I agree that it brings up way too many thoughts that I want to address, and I would like to hold on to all of them. However, one of the things we talked about last week was at the individual level, what can you do? And what you can do is, by definition, do all you can do individually. You can control that. You don't have control over what the Chinese government decides to do individually by going out and issuing a decree and changing what they're going to do. We have control over what we're going to do, and there are things we can individually do. At a minimum, we will all feel better about ourselves that we're doing everything we can do. Going beyond that, yes, that, what is it, 3, 4 to 5 degrees of separation,
right,
depending on who you listen to, that you're only a few people removed from getting to other people, getting a message, especially if you lead by example and do everything you can do, and people are aware of that around you, that can become infectious. Everybody can start doing what they can do, and that's how movements start. And we just this past week saw a movement that started with one little girl taking an action a year ago, and now all of a sudden millions of people around the world were following that example and trying to bring awareness to climate change. So I really do believe that we should all be doing everything we can do. Also, when you talked about knowing someone who knows somebody who knows the governor, it brought another issue up. A very simple message I would like to just insert into this discussion right this moment. I need your help. With anybody who's listening to this, if they know someone who knows Bill Gates, I have been trying to get in direct touch with him for one very definite reason. With the pollination problem, especially since he owns a blueberry farm only a few miles away from ours, the Gates Foundation controls tens of billions of dollars worth of agricultural property to try to do those things that they try to do to help mankind. And Bill and Melinda Gates have been very active in a number of different initiatives. One I would like for them to get active in is the insect issue that we've talked about now on 2 different podcasts. I would like for them to team up with us and build a terrarium effectively, and protect the pollinators by having perpetually blooming plants in a controlled environment, much like a seed vault, only this will be an active pollinator vault. Cool. And we can then pull the overpopulation out to replenish the diminishing population because of the insecticide issue and the climate change issue, because we're not going to let insecticides in, and we're not going to have the massive, huge swings in climate that affect everything with the pollinator issue. So again, one of the things we talked about last time was the creed. You don't have the right to complain about a problem. You have the obligation to propose a solution. When I've sat early in the morning with all the birds in my backyard, discussing this issue that they're facing and we're all facing, I actually said, ultimately, one of the solutions is to have that kind of a controlled environment, to realize we have a precious natural resource that we need to be protecting right now because they're under assault, and we need them for our survival. So when I mentioned desperate times call for desperate measures, I feel like we need desperate measures. And moving forward with something like that, which the Gates Foundation has all the resources I need, and I have the plan. I've already designed and engineered it. So those kind of things, if anybody out there has that connection, I'll continue to try on my own, but I would certainly appreciate anybody's help that can make that happen. We would all benefit. We're all in this together. It's not something that we're talking about that they have a problem. It's we.
Well, it's interesting that you should mention that. I do know someone who's helping to fund and is active on the board of the Aspen Institute. And I suspect that there's somebody on that board who knows Bill Gates. And so 1 degree of separation, 2 degrees of separation, 3 degrees. So I'll get a hold of them and see what, and present this issue. If you've got some paperwork on it, whatever, we can send it off to them. That's the way it's done. You know, a little story about wavy gravy. I don't know if you ever run into wavy gravy. It sounds like some kind of lyric from a Frank Zappa tune. But wavy gravy was Hugh Romney out of the second city of Chicago in the 60s. And I met him when he was paisleying his Oldsmobile with 3/4 of an inch to 1.5 bits of comic books. He was doing decoupage of this huge American car, and he had a cartoon that he would walk into the LA Free Press every week. Very strange cartoon, using Hollywood stills from strange movies. But he also did a stand-up routine, and he did it at the Astro on Melrose Boulevard there. And so one day I said, I'm going to go see what his routine is like. So I went, and he had this one bit. I don't remember any of the rest of what he said that night, but this one just stuck with me. He said, you know, last Saturday night, I had a few beers, and then I had a few more beers. pretty soon I had a real headache, and I finally just crashed, and then I woke up the next morning, and sort of stumbled, into the bathroom to splash cold water on my face and try to like get my human body back together. And he said, and I looked into the mirror, and I said, and he had this flash. He said, it's all done with people. So instead of mirrors, so it's all done with people. Basically, we like to think that everything is done with people, but that's not quite true. But a lot of what we can do is done with people. And how don't you have a to-do list? I mean, I don't. Well, I do, but I forget where it is. But many people have to-do lists. Pick up the milk, get the eggs.
Find the to-do list.
Find the to-do list. That's what. Yeah. Find it. Wait a minute. I can't do that because I catch 22 there. But go to the cleaners. Whatever you do, during the day. Oh, don't forget to pick up your kid from the babysitter. Anyway, whatever that is. And so, could we add just one to-do list, which is think about our environment. I'm not asking anybody to do anything, God forbid, but just bring it up to yourself and let it sit there a little while. Then go about your business and see if we can't deepen that monologue, which then might spill over into a dialogue with your significant other person or whatever, at the breakfast table with the kids or something. Something will then have been a seed, will have been planted. And so it all starts with a seed. I'm hoping that this podcast will be a seed for folks, and that they begin to say, well, it's not a downer. I mean, I have my own view of the universe is it's not what we do, it's how we do it. So it doesn't matter what your station in life, and certainly if you don't define yourself by your job, because that's a whole other topic that could come up about the robots and what your self-worth is. We have to get prepared for a whole different notion of who human beings really are and how we've been, from my point of view, been given divinity or some over the earth. If we take this to be biblical and its admonition, wow, we're doing a lousy job. Dominion over the earth. Whoops. Hey, wait a minute. There's not as much here as when I left. You know what I mean? Anyway.
Well, and another thing you mentioned that directly relates to that is we do need to listen to Mother Nature and what we need to be taught. Nature has a history of eliminating the species that is causing problems. And when you get an overbalance of a species, then things just naturally occur for that species to be limited. In some cases, that species becomes extinct if that species is causing a problem. When you look at the species that it seems is causing the majority of the problems today, that would be us. And so again, we don't want to be negative, but being realistic, when you then move into for example, the discussion of AI, yeah. What would AI do if AI were in control? Artificial intelligence among, computers, if they were sentient, which we all take comfort in most of the opinions of scientists that they aren't yet. But what would their natural conclusion be? What is it on this planet?
There's a lot of science fiction about this.
Yes, and it's a recurring theme in science fiction, but it seems like there's a reason. And so whether we want to learn from science fiction or whether we want to learn from Mother Nature, it's effectively the same lesson that we need to sit back and listen to, and then look in a mirror and realize there is a lot that we can individually do. And again, I love the perspective that even though you're not going to solve the global issue yourself this week,
right.
everything that you do, you're going to feel better about the overall situation and take a more constructive, positive view of what's going on and what you're doing. And that can be infectious. That's the way movements start. And each movement starts with an individual and then a group, and then it spreads. And that is one of the benefits of having a global society with the communication capabilities we have.
Yeah.
One little seed can be planted, but where it used to take generations for that seed to spread, now that seed can spread globally in a very short period of time.
One 16-year-old girl sitting by herself in front of the Swedish Parliament building, come rain or shine, was soon joined by a few of her classmates. Kept her company, and then somebody else picked up on it. Pretty soon it was on the internet, and then all of a sudden, well, we could do that. And she got permission from her parents to skip school on Fridays, and she simply said it's Friday for the future. And typical logical, unworldly child that she is, said, well, why should I be in school learning about a future I'm not going to have? What? That's pretty strong logic.
Mm-hmm.
It's very simple logic, which anyone can grasp. Why are you preparing for a job that does not exist and will not exist? And I have a daughter who's in the junior college system up in Oregon, Mount Hood Junior College, 30,000 students. And they have several problems. One is they try to train people for the jobs that exist in the high tech and other things around there. They need programmers, they need this, they need that. Well, AI is doing programming. They learn a lot quicker and understand how to programs that make programs. So after your 2-year degree and you've spent all this borrowed money because you don't have any money yourself to get the degree, it is irrelevant. Oops, that's one problem they're having. It's just one of them. Secondly, the humans that go there are trying to get, that absurd idea of pulling your own self up by your own bootstraps is a kind of, if you really visualize that, it doesn't work. I just want to let you know, so don't try to do that at home. But you can get some help from other people, and so usually you have a butler do that? Anyway, pull your boots on. I've seen it in many English movies. So what's the problem here? Well, I go back to my multinational companies are bigger than any state. And they'll be happy to have you at the taxpayer's expense train their employees. And to a certain extent, businesses go where there are trained employees. They don't go there because the land is cheap, or it's outside of the transportation hub, or its suppliers are millions of miles away. No, it goes there because there's a trained workforce who can then be retrained to do what they do. So once again, who's in charge here? And you could say, well, when we have laws about that, we seem to be able, as a species, to do it just because we want to. It's a tremendous power. It's godlike. Be, and it was. That was the word, and that was it. The biggest ego that there is. It's not your power or my power. It's the power. Okay. Well, where does wisdom come in? Because just because you can do something, does that mean you should?
Mm-hmm.
I bet I can race across the street in front of that car in the middle of between the lights, and I can make it safely. The car driver is thinking, wow, an untrammeled quarter mile, I'm going to see how fast I can get to 60. And so the light changes, you take off, and they take off. And they're quicker than you. And you end up like a blood splat on their windshield. Maybe you oughtn't to have done that. I'm just saying, simple wisdom. So what are we doing? We can do many things. When I was listening to you about Mother Nature taking care of sometimes extincting a species that's causing a lot of problems. This is not a delicate discussion.
No.
But let's say that we develop the ability to excrete not our normal biodegradable and therefore fecundating poop, and that you can actually grow more and better plants in that if you make sure it's certain liquidity and a certain consistency and so on. But our species can make chemicals that are absolutely devastating to nature.
Mm-hmm.
Wow. It's, and it's not the grizzly bears doing it. It's not the end of the species line cougar. It's not, wolf pack. It's us. And we've managed to excrete from our exoskeletons. That's what I call an automobile. We're soft, punchy things, speaking for myself alone, that go climb into an exoskeleton, and it provides my transportation much faster than I could certainly move this body around. But that's an exoskeleton, and it is secreting poisons.
Mm-hmm.
So with Mother Nature, I don't think is going to make a fine point to decide, hey, it's not the humans, it's what they're building. I don't think that no. I don't think I don't think it's discriminatory in that way. I might be wrong. Maybe go, okay, if we can just get them to stop doing that, then the little soft worm people, they can stay.
Well, what's interesting in several different ways is what you just talked about is an example of the kind of conversations we normally have. They jump all around. They touch on all kinds of different aspects. We go from Greek philosophers to exoskeletons that excrete poisonous, toxic fumes. Yeah, the fact is, all of it is connected. It all relates to our life on this planet, and it all relates to the times that we are facing. And I wanted to kind of be sure to wrap up today and toward the end of the discussion and just mention to people that something that we decided early on is if anything we're discussing, we happen to voice something that you don't particularly agree with, you don't look at it that way at all, or maybe you look at it in a totally opposite manner. In my experience, not necessarily speaking for both of us, but I think we're in agreement, something that we say that you don't particularly agree with will either hopefully cause you to think about the issue more, think about it in a different way, or better yet, let us know a better solution or a better perspective on this, because we want people to give us feedback. We'd like for this discussion, even though we do bounce around because everything's connected, it would be very interesting to hear a different perspective, or to hear that at least we voiced something that someone did or did not agree with, and it made them think about some of these topics in a different way. One other thing, that going out with something that's in the recesses of my mind that just happened to activate. When we've been talking about what we could do individually, and when we've been talking about the whole purpose of these podcasts and the name of this town, Truth or Consequences, and I like your conjunctive, and consequences, it reminded me again of something that I think about often. The individual who first developed the mathematics of the equations to calculate probability, a guy named Blaise Pascal. They even named a computer language after him early on. Blaise Pascal was the first man who could ever walk up to a bridge over a deep ravine and look at the structure and write out calculations and calculate whether or not the load he was carrying on his cart was likely to be able to go across that bridge without falling to his death. He could calculate that probability. Before him, in the 15th century, I believe it was, no one could calculate probability. And then later, as he started thinking about how great it was to be able to calculate probability, he realized and concluded Wise decisions, you mentioned wisdom. Wise decisions are not made based on probability. Wise decisions are made based on consequences. And his logic was, yes, I could calculate there's a 90% chance of my load making it across that bridge. But if there's a 10% chance that I will fall to my death, the consequences outweigh the probability, and therefore wise decisions to take a different route. Well, right now we're talking about things in this conversation, quite a few different things that have a very high probability of having a very significant impact on our lives. But I would propose that it's not wise to think about the probability of what we're discussing, but rather the consequences of what we're discussing. And if that doesn't cause you to become passionate about these issues and cause you to want to look at what you can do and start doing it, then I don't believe there's anything we can say that's going to motivate someone, because these are huge issues. They're fun to talk about, but they're also fun to do something about, whatever it is we have within our individual power to take action.
I think going back to my analogy of the guy who thought he could beat the car because the probability, really, he kind of did a mental calculation. Of course, the variables changed. And so the premises that you're calculating from change. And part of the problem of global warming is that there are so many factors involved that things become geometrically progressive and not arithmetically progressive. So, like, pick one, Arctic warming or something like that, lack of reflectivity. You start with the industrial pollution and coal-fired plants. You put that little particulate, doesn't really mean too much. You're not breathing it, it's going up. But it's going on the jet stream, and it's meeting other particulate matter, and then it's landing on the Arctic ice. And so the reflectivity, if you notice how blinding ice is when you got to put those big, heavy goggles on, tremendously reflective, and it's reflecting the heat back up to the sun, but a little grayer, and all of a sudden it's absorbing. So the wisdom of the guy would be, there's a probability that car is not going to do what I think it's going to do. It's going to suddenly accelerate and wipe me out. The wisdom is, don't get off the curb, or pick a different, scenario, go to the corner, because you won't survive that probability. Mm-hmm. And it's my joke is used about statisticians, in which the statistician who drowned, and I said, well, why did he drown? He knew he said, well, what he knew was the mean depth of the water of the river was 3 feet. And how can you possibly drown in 3 feet of water? Except where he chose to go in, it was 12 feet, because he was talking about an average. So that's a real problem with, we would like to take the answer that agrees with our prejudice, our predisposition, our want, our desire. I think we said earlier, you don't make decisions out of facts. You make because you want to do them out of emotion. And so can we be emotionally involved in wisdom? You know what I mean? It's not as we have all these games that have wars going on in them, and people pushing people back and forth and shooting guns and blowing people up and all of that, which was essentially, arguably somewhere around 1878, and how they used to fight wars, and then the cannons got bigger, and then First World War, and then terrible things. Finally, we got really good at it in the Second World War, hurl things long distances and blow people up. This war that we're speaking of, and it is a war, it's a war of subtleness. It's a war of peace. I mean, you can't make peace by going to war. I mean, if you were wise, you would have the peace talks first and not just say that war is a possibility. It is not a possibility. It's not. It needs to be outlawed. That's a whole other topic. But can we engage each other in a conversation about the heroism of thought. Can we understand that our lives and lives of countless generations depend upon taking seriously that which it's hard to see, or hold on to until too late, until that crop failed, because it was a monocrop, and it wasn't, and we got to the end of that, and so on. So, Bob, thank you for once again, and maybe you're indulging me in my scatterbrained idiocy, but I do have a lot of factoids up here, and they come out from time to time. I hope you folks will present some of yours. So we're gonna this time we're getting more sophisticated in our little studio here. This is the Gila cave dwelling scene behind us. It reminds us that for 80 years here in southern New Mexico, there was a really big drought, and the hunter-gatherers had to live in caves, and because they had found an underground water source. So that's what we're doing here, and I use that to remind myself that times change, and we need to prepare for them, and we need to understand what's going on, the dynamics. But in this case, we're going to take sections out of this recording. We'll put them up on different parts of the internet and see if we can engage people to come and listen to us and to listen to themselves and bring their own wisdom. So thank you very much from Turtletalks. Thank you, Bob.
Thank you for having me.
Oh, wow. Thanks for coming. Wow.